All right, I think we can get started. I've got some people here. So why don't we get going? So my name is Jeff, and I have Esther with me here. Hopefully you can see her on the screen as well. And today we're going to talk about how to track and control your AML costs. And I hope you can see the slides. Let me just see here. So here's what we want to do. So it's a short session. So I'll just do a couple of intros and housekeeping. Then Esther's going to tell us about AML cost KPIs. And then I've got a few questions prepared to ask Esther. And at the tail end of the session, then we've got time for you guys to ask your questions through Zoom. So in terms of intros and housekeeping stuff. So Esther and I are both from Salv. We actually both came from TransferWise before this. Esther was building up the AML product in TransferWise, and now she's leading product for us. And myself, I'm one of the co-founders of Salv, and previously at TransferWise, and I was focused on kind of people topics, analytics, and a bunch of other stuff. And before that, Tavi, our CEO, and we focus on anti-fraud and other things at Skype. So that's us. And sorry, just going back to this one. So Salv is building an AML platform to focus on transaction monitoring and sanctions and a couple of other things. So there's a if you're new to Zoom, there's a button on the Zoom bar that's Q&A, so you can ask any questions you want in there, and we're going to have a couple of polls as well that pop up, and you can just answer those, kind of like multiple choice, quick answer things. So just about this Zoom thing, so no one can see you or hear you, so don't worry about what you're wearing. Probably everybody's still in their kind of self-isolation mode. So don't worry about that. Don't worry about eating or drinking or noise or kids or all that kind of stuff. And you also don't really need to take notes if you don't want to. So just, you can focus your attention. So we'll send you the slides after, and we'll send you a link, like a copy of this thing. We're recording it. And if there are any questions that we can't get to just because of time, then we'll answer those in email after as well. Okay, so I want to start with the first poll. Just the first question of two questions that we have for you today. So we have mostly compliance people and AML people on this call. So we wanted to ask you, how developed are your AML team's cost KPIs? And I hope the poll will come up in a moment here. And the four options are, we've been setting them for years. It's kind of old news for you. We're just starting to set them. We haven't started setting them yet, and I don't know what a cost KPI is. So if you could take a moment to just answer that, and we can dive into the content, and then we'll show you the results in 5 or 10 minutes. So I'll now hand over to Esther, and she's going to walk us through cost KPIs in AML.
Yes, hello everyone. So this is actually our second webinar on the topic of KPIs. And last time we talked about crime fighting, but this time the topic is cost, which is probably quite relevant in the current conditions, considering COVID-19 and the economic situation and so on. So I am going to throw a couple of examples of KPIs at you, but I'm not going to spend too much time on this, because when it comes to the cost KPIs, then yes, the first step is to measure, but the main thing and main consideration is how to drive these KPIs. So I'm hoping that we will have a chance to discuss it during the questions part. So. The first one, kind of general blanket approach, which is always good to do, is the general compliance cost per transaction. Why it's important to measure is that it gives you a very high level overview. If you work in larger banks, then this is something that's very relevant on the board level. It's true that it doesn't illustrate the detail very well. So if you want to zoom into like specific problematic areas, then you have to split it up a bit. But it's definitely something I would recommend you to look at. And also another factor that's also like slightly higher level, but it gives you an understanding on what's the effort your company is taking when it comes to compliance. In some cases, we've seen that that this like percentage of total company costs is up to 30%, which definitely isn't okay. Like, and then you have like food for thought around what needs to be cut and why you're spending so much on compliance. So yeah. And this one is actually similar, but it's more linked to the headcount, because the cost itself obviously consists of several factors. It's not only like salaries of people, but it's also what you're paying for external services and all of that stuff. So sometimes it's also good to look at the headcount, because in our experience, headcount can be the driver behind the cost. Not always, but good to look at. Yeah. And then cost per manual check. This isn't anymore such a high level metric, but like one area where I have found it useful is that this illustrates very well the cost that you would incur by going live with new products, expanding to new areas. So basically, you would know that if your company is going to expand into more high-risk market, then like this would cause you to have more alerts, more verification checks, and so on. And if you can, like, if you have calculated what the cost of these checks is for you, then you can forecast very well the additional cost that you will need to incur. Yeah. So yeah, that's like it from a high level overview, because as I mentioned, one thing is measuring these things, but another really different thing and what is much more complicated is driving these and understanding what's like a decent level for you. So.
Okay, thank you, Esther. Okay, so I'd like to take a look at the answers for the for this little poll that we did. So here we go. Here's the answers. I wonder if it shows up on my screen here. Maybe you can see it. Esther, can you confirm? Can you see the poll now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so the question was, how developed are your AML team's cost KPIs? And the top answer is that we're just starting to set them. All right, that's pretty typical. And yeah, maybe a quarter of you said that you've been setting them for years, and yeah, maybe another quarter are just haven't really thought about it yet. All right, cool. Close that, and we have a second question for you, and it's around this crisis, this kind of weird period that we're in right now. So how much has Corona or kind of this crisis affected your company's focus on AML costs? So we're spending more on AML because there are maybe more scams going on and you're worried about that. No change since before the crisis. We have to spend less on it or something else. And if you wanted to, if you want to answer other, it'd be amazing if you did that. You can just comment in the chat. There's a little button on the Zoom toolbar for that. Okay, so now I'd like to ask Esther a few questions that I've pulled together just as I was thinking about it. And we are in this really sort of very interesting time, and a lot of the fintechs and a lot of the banks that we're talking to, they're more worried about costs basically, and it's just like over the whole company they're seeing a reduction in revenue. They're wondering about like how can we optimize our costs and so forth. And I wanted to ask you, Esther, how have you seen companies cut costs in AML like quite a bit, basically? So this time, kind of like a lot of companies are thinking about this. So how have you seen it done?
Yeah, like obviously the question also is how do you cut the costs successfully? Because option one, the easiest option always, is to just fire people and see what happens. But clearly that's not the way to go. Yeah, in general, and maybe not so much in current situation, the aim is still like, if you have hired smart people, you don't want to fire them. You just want to use their resources wisely. Yes, like in current situation, you can also like cut some people, but by far the best and most successful solution to cost cutting I have seen is automation, actually. So you just have to automate the manual and tedious tasks that your team is doing. Like if they're spending loads of time sending out some emails to account executives or directly to the customers, then why not automate this information gathering? Plus, if they need to, most of their days spent filling in some suspicious activity reporting forms or whatever, this part can also be automated. So yeah, like automation is the key.
Okay, and what about, I think I'd agree with that. What about just, do companies change what criminals they look at? Like, can they zoom in closer so that there's less false positives, maybe? Or
oh yeah, definitely. So if you go back to the previous webinar, the crime fighting part, one of the main KPIs we highlighted there was the alert to SAR ratio. So if it's extremely low, then definitely you're wasting a lot of resources. Maybe you don't need so many people, because I mean, the regulator is not expecting you to review alerts just because. And if you're catching like only 0.5% of criminals with that, then it's not really a thing you should do. No one's expecting it. So just optimize your transaction monitoring scenarios and other controls, I would say.
Okay. So we were just talking, you were just telling us about the KPIs and you know, how you can basically try to understand your own costs actually in AML. So how do these metrics or these KPIs, how do they fit into the story when your board, your management team, like they're asking you to cut costs? So how do you know, like how do these KPIs fit into that basically?
Yeah, well, the cost KPIs do not exist in isolation from other metrics you have. Because if you are faced with cost cutting, then you really have to take a hard look in the mirror. So slightly repeating myself, but it boils down to the question, is your team really doing a meaningful job, or is it just like box ticking? Because like no one expects box ticking from you. So in essence, what you can look at is like, is your true positive ratio high enough? If it isn't, then you have to answer the question, do you have the technology to optimize it? Hopefully you have. So if it's already optimized, you cannot do anything there, then the question is, if your team is struggling, if you cannot cut people at the moment, do you need to optimize the onboarding processes? Are you targeting the right customers? Maybe your customer base is too risky, and that actually justifies the compliance cost that you have on the table. So in that sense, then it's up to the board or the management or whoever is the decision maker to say that, yeah, okay, we're willing to accept the fact that our customer base is quite risky and thus our compliance cost is quite high and we cannot cut it. That's like one thing. And then like once you have gone through these options and you come up to the magic automation topic again, then it becomes trickier because automation requires technology. You cannot really do it without. And then there's the question whether you buy it or you build it internally, right? So this is not like a sales pitch. So my point is that if you are considering like building it yourself, then you should take a hard look at the numbers. How many developers do you need to build it? And how many do you need every year to maintain it? Because like, no solution will like ever be completely ready. So in London, you're paying like 80K per year per one developer. So just add up the costs and try to calculate if you would pay less for an external product. And if that's the case, then this is actually a place where you can cut cost. So you can either redirect the development resources from compliance to some other areas, or well, you can cut some people. So yeah, so it's not like a straightforward answer to this, but there are several considerations you have to take into account.
Mm-hmm. And you said something really interesting earlier on that having these cost KPIs like pretty well defined, pretty well understood, actually that can help you with when you're discussing with other teams, basically, or you know, senior management of the company. So like, is our customer base too busy, like, or too risky for us? Is that the reason that our compliance costs are so high? And maybe there's kind of a good justification for why our compliance costs are higher, because yeah, our customer base is risky, and there's maybe different ways that you can solve that. And maybe yeah, okay, very interesting. Okay, and so some companies are worried that that they will cut too far, basically. So you know, revenue's down by 30%. So okay, AML team, you've got to cut 30%, but you can use these KPIs to try to understand, okay, what will happen. Is that reasonable or not? But what are some of the signs you would look for to know if you've cut sort of too deeply?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, slightly again repeating myself, but there are like a couple of questions you need to ask. If you see that your team is struggling or is going to struggle if you cut it down by 30%. So first of all, again, are they doing a meaningful job? So is the resource effectively used? Have you fine-tuned your onboarding processes? Yes. Okay. You have automated as much as possible. Yes. And then you come up with, but my team still cannot handle the workload. Then I would say that you have gone too far. And you can also predict this using like the forecasting. You can take your current headcount, how many tasks they're able to handle per day, cut it down by 30% in the headcount, and see what you end up with. So it isn't like black magic. It's completely doable with the magic of numbers.
Okay, I see one challenge in that, and that is that you know, a lot of companies, they could, you know, let's just pick the say the 30%, something like this. So they cut 30%. They let people go, actually, so that they've got less capacity for sure. Tomorrow, actually, probably everything's fine. Maybe next week it's even fine-ish. Maybe things are starting to pile up. But at some point, you might run into problems, actually. So you would maybe see backlogs increasing. You would see quality dropping, like quality of the review dropping. What are kind of other things that you would like kind of see that wouldn't happen immediately if you've cut deeply?
Mm-hmm. The main thing that takes time to accumulate in these cases is the backlog itself. So usually you don't grow a huge backlog in a couple of days or maybe even a couple of weeks, but you have to constantly check if it's like always growing, because that's like a warning sign already for you. Then you can figure out how you can impact it. Can you somehow implement a more risk-based approach to how you do transaction monitoring or sanction screening or PEP checks or whatever? Or if you can't do it, then you have to just think that, okay, maybe I need to start rehiring, because like hiring takes a long time, as we know.
Yeah, and how would you keep an eye on kind of the risk, basically? So you sort of like tighten your controls. How would you know if you're starting to take too much risk as a result of like, okay, we need to really contain our costs, contain our backlog? Um,
Well, that's like a very philosophical question in the compliance domain. How do you define the risk and so on? But and it's not like easy to achieve. But in the end, it boils down to your company's risk appetite. So how much risk are you willing to take? Again, it's difficult to define. Doesn't directly link back to the cost topic that we're talking about today, but it's definitely a thinking exercise that I suggest you go through, because then it's also easier to make these types of decisions.
Yeah. Okay. And maybe just to wrap up, I would say kind of one theme that we've been talking about in the last webinar, in this webinar, probably like actually in this whole series, is that if you have good KPIs, then these kind of decisions are, maybe a little bit easier. I mean, at least you know where you stand. And, companies are having to make difficult decisions right now. And KPIs, although they take a little bit of work to set up, they can give you a lot of insight and help you have better conversations with leaders of the business and so forth. And so that you don't take on too much risk, you still keep everything safe. Okay, so let's go back to this second poll question, and there's time now just after this for if there are any questions in the chat, and I'll take a look at that in a second. So the question was, how much has Corona affected your company's focus on AML costs? And yeah, very few are spending more on it. Most, like 70%, are there's no change. And yeah, about a quarter of the people are saying that we now have to spend less on AML. So that's very interesting. Okay, let me see if I can get to the chat here. So we've got the chat here, and sorry, I'm just going to open it up here. See if there are any questions. I don't see any questions in here. So, okay, I'll give it, 10, 15 seconds if you're just typing. Otherwise, we can wrap up a couple of minutes early. Let me see here. Okay, I don't see any questions. So if you do have questions, then you can, if you wanted to ask a question and send it anonymously, you definitely can. But otherwise, I'll wrap up. You can feel free to email Esther or email me with the email addresses that are there. We've also written a blog about this, or Esther has actually, that goes into this in more detail, and you can check it out there. We will send you a copy of these slides. We'll send you a copy of this recording if you want to, if you missed the first 5 minutes or something, or you want to share it with a colleague, that'd be really cool. And otherwise, we will see you next time, talking about KPIs or something else AML related. So thank you very much for participating, and have a great rest of the week.
Okay, bye everyone.